we making sure that as IT teams, we are increasing our resilience when things maybe don't always go the way that we want to, which I think sounds crazy to think, right? In IT, everything always goes perfectly. But I really want to start with something that we see a lot at NinjaOne, which I call the visibility myth, which is that many agencies believe they have visibility, but what they really have is just partial visibility within their department, within their agency. And really, I kind of define that as a boundary. And it introduces this concept called minimum viability integration, which is saying, a lot of government agencies that we meet with are doing a great job of connecting systems as much as they need to achieve a specified outcome. But that outcome doesn't always mean they're connecting all of these different agencies as much as they need to, or sometimes maybe even should, right? As agencies integrate systems, a lot of times we're seeing folks integrate things like workflows, patch orchestration, monitoring, automation, some of these different areas. But each time we're creating those connections, it does create what I would define as a dependency risk. So minimal viable integration asks, what's the smallest level of connection needed to get to my outcome? And that's really what we're seeing a lot of different agencies use today. So if I could set a stage, and an audience, I'm going to need some help with some participation, but to set a stage, right, if there was a statewide initiative launched that leveraged a shared digital licensing platform used by 3 agencies, and let's say the endpoints are spanning across agency managed laptops, contractor devices, digital platforms, and cloud hosted workloads, and a routine patch fails in one agency's environment, within hours, data synchronization is bound to break. And now we're having a risk for citizen facing services. Can anybody answer for your organization, who owns that remediation and what visibility gap typically is going to matter the most? Is there anybody willing to share what your current strategy is around that?
And I think everyone should be able to unmute your microphone, or you can also use the chat feature.
Hi, my name is Michelle Thomas. I have a few thoughts on that great question. I came from the public sector on the federal side, and I'm also the former CTO of the state of Maryland. And one of the things that we learned is that responsibility or attribution for things going awry starts with well-written contracts when you're using external third parties, and also internal agreements when you're using, when several different agencies within one state government are using data for various purposes. Governance is also important. That's going to help you and your stakeholders and your executives understand who's responsible for what and who owns what. So it's kind of a combination of things, I think, along with some learning. We used to, at the state of Maryland, we used to meet with all this agency CIOs on a monthly basis, and we'd talk about, issues that we were experiencing and how to improve services and how to do better at what we were doing. We also did that at the federal level. But I think if you're using external parties to manage your data in the cloud, for example, and you're using several different kinds of cloud platforms, like maybe ServiceNow and Salesforce, for example, along with something internal, you really have to have the third parties and the governance tightened up to a degree where you can trust what people are doing. You can trust how the data is going from one place to another, how it's being used, in what context. Having a data management platform is also extremely helpful. So we learned all of those things.
No, thank you for sharing that, Michelle. And I think, right, you touched on something that I'm going to jump to here in a little bit, which is really treating a lot of what your approach is, not just as documentation, but really building it more as architecture and having some of that cross collaboration, which it sounds like your team does, which is really, really cool to hear. I think when I think of some of the different visibility and some of the different issues that we hear from folks, typically I see that, you mentioned Salesforce and ServiceNow, that integration will often fail faster than any security controls that we have in place. And at least to say visibility is usually the first fault line that we're going to see. And I think the more we see agencies integrate, the more they give up local control. And I think that tension never goes away, right? In IT, a lot of folks like to be able to have full control over everything that they're seeing across their environment. So whether it's Michelle or anybody else, in your opinions, what are things that you think need to remain local versus things that we could standardize, whether it's across an entire state or across an entire org? I don't know if there's some sort of shared asset inventory that folks have been looking at leveraging or do leverage today that's allowed for streamlined operations.
I can tell you what we did at the federal level, and it's just as feasible at the state level. Um, and that is using DSPM and a data management platform to help understand your data, what it is, where it is, and in what context it's being used, can help to identify simple little things like we discovered in Maryland, where uh, the metaphor I like to use is people thought of data like that scene in Finding Nemo where the seagulls were at towards the end, flying over the harbor, seeing all the fish, and they were going, mine, 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 mine. And there was this mindset of this data is mine, and I don't want to share it. And one of the things that we discovered in a federal agency where I was the deputy CTO was the data duplication was incredibly high. I'm I'm talking just absolutely abhorrently high because agencies wanted to keep, they had social security numbers redundantly across the 27 different agencies in this one federal executive agency. And that happens a lot. It's very common. And so when you look at sharing data, you have to use some sort of governance plus data management capability so that you don't duplicate. You reuse, but you don't duplicate your data. It's going to reduce your costs. It's going to make security easier because you're going to understand not only the context under which it's being used, but where it's located. It's not in 33 different databases or platforms. It's in one, and everybody shares and reuses. And if you have the proper cybersecurity and data security controls, it really helps to avoid some of the things that you described.
That's awesome. And thank you so much for sharing that, both from a federal and the state perspective. And I think to me, right, it kind of highlights that operational trust typically begins with shared visibility and shared data, not just shared tools. And I think a lot of IT teams that we work with say, hey, if we're all using tool A, B, and C, that we're all getting the same data. And to your point, Michelle, I don't think that's always the case. And I think, right, it kind of alludes to what I want to jump into next is some of the different accountability and risk alignment that we're seeing across some of these different agencies is I think most cross agency failures, they're not technical, right? It's just ownership ambiguity. And an example I've seen is, let's say agency A says, hey, there's an issue that originated in agency B's environment. Well, agency B is going to say, hey, well, hold on, don't put this on me. It's the shared vendor, that patch that caused some of the different instability. So, again, Michelle, if it's you or if somebody else wants to chime in here, but in your organizations, who is accountable when the system is shared, but maybe the infrastructure is not? And is there anybody that, or anyone or any team that's leading a lot of the incident coordination? Not sure if that's come up for any other teams.
So we in our organization at the state of Montana, we're not quite there yet. We just started with our AI program, and hopefully we'll get to that point where we've got multiple people sitting at the table because each person is going to understand and have different risks and understand what those risks are, whether you're the software engineer or you're the AI engineer or you're the CISO or you're the purchasing officer. Everybody's got their own risks. So having them all sitting at the table, I don't think it's going to fall to just one person. But right now in our organization, it would fall to the security team.
Got it. No, and that's typically right what we hear, and it sounds like you in the state of Montana, your team's already starting to get ahead of it. Because I think incident response often breaks at that handoff between some of the organizations and not just necessarily inside of them. So no, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that information. I think too, right, when we're talking about the example of agency A and agency B and the raising the hand, it's thinking about those escalation pathways. And I know Michelle touched on this earlier, and I mentioned, right, thinking of them more as an architecture, not documentation. Because when we treat some of the different ways that we want to escalate these issues as architecture, we're increasing ultimately, right, what the goal is operational trust. Security frameworks can establish technical trust, but operational trust is how teams are behaving during a failure. My father was a Marine, so I heard growing up nonstop, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's a quote from Mike Tyson. And I think a lot of security teams and a lot of IT teams in general face that same thing, where we have documented steps as to how to handle a failure or something that didn't go the way it was supposed to go. And sometimes that documentation doesn't fully get laid out the way that we want it to. And so thinking of it a little bit more as an architecture. But does anybody in this room have a strong example of how you've established trust between agencies operationally? I know Michelle shared earlier, a lot of the different CTOs are meeting on a regular basis. Are there any other teams that are currently working through some of these cross-agency relationships through meetings, or that could be through exercises or some type of shared tooling? I think most often we're going to hear it's based on meetings, but I just didn't know if any states or any other folks on here have used exercises, or if there's any particular tools out there that have really helped you.
Brandon, just to piggyback on that, one of the things that I think we've heard is very difficult to communicate outside of IT, right? When you're IT trying to explain things, when you start talking enterprise architecture and how things fit in is so important. But if there's a way that folks have found, kind of to your question, to really explain that well, or help kind of your agency leaders or others understand that, whether it's through exercises or tools, I'd be very interested, because that's a big pain point we've heard. And any ideas you have too, Brandon?
Definitely. I'll see if anybody wants to jump off mute here. And the reality is, right, this is open discussion. The answer may be not yet, or we haven't gotten there. And that's totally okay. I think this is all right to be collaborative and make sure that, hey, if there's somebody out there that's got a strategy that's working great, can other folks piggyback off that and look to leverage it in their own teams? All right, we'll leave that one as a we're working on it. But when I think of, right, we've talked about failures and when things go wrong, and how to look at things from an architectural standpoint rather than just documentation. But I think when we are talking, right, about what this is really about, is it's IT resiliency. And how do we manage, and how does our resiliency look when we're in a state of recovery? So again, we've given a few scenarios where we've called out, hey, something can fail, right? And how we define that ownership. But if we move into recovery in particular, how systems recover across agencies, I'd be curious for any folks on the call, we mentioned earlier the escalation pathways. So let's say services go down across the state, and we need those services restored in 24 hours. When this happens, oftentimes it's not just public trust that can be at risk, but Leah mentioned, right, teams and enterprise organizations, teams that exist outside of IT, right? So we're talking about our own state employees' trust also starts to come into risk. Does anybody have a recovery playbook, or for any teams, is there any sort of manual or automated processes that can help speed up or that potentially slow down what the recovery looks like?
I'd say the first step probably would be making sure that my RPO and RTO align with the vendor. If we're not on the same page, we're gonna have an issue of even getting going.
Right.
That's as far as I know, but I do know that it's so critical in the contract is ensuring that the vendor can meet what you're needing.
Got it. Yeah, no, I think collaboration with a vendor, I think something that any folks that have ever met with me at NinjaOne, right? I will always say, hey, if you're going to trust NinjaOne, the onus is on us as the vendor to deliver on your needs. And so if that need, right, potentially fails and we're in a state of recovery, being able to meet and collaborate, ensure that we're all lockstep and on the same page, 100% agree, Sarah. I think that's of utmost importance.
That's a good point. This is Michelle again. That Sarah mentioned. One thing that I've used at both the state and the federal level is software by a company. I don't know if I can mention them, but we use them for emergency management. Where, in the state of Maryland or in Washington, D.C., you're in the middle of all the political activity that can cause things to break, shall we say, and it can lead to a lot of consternation, a lot of cost, and all sorts of stuff. So using something, and we learned this during the January riots several years ago, where I was working at the U.S. Department of Labor, which was right across the street from the Capitol. And some of the protesters had entered our parking garage. And so that taught us that our mechanisms of, okay, whoever the cop was in the garage that was responsible had to call somebody who had to call somebody to notify somebody to notify somebody. And by the time it happened, things had escalated beyond an easily manageable point. So we looked at using software to help us with managing information and making sure that the right people get the right message at the same time, and that communications are consistent. And that helped also when critical infrastructure places like utilities and state managed utilities or hospitals had issues with physical security, and helping direct people and citizens safely out of a particular geographic zone that you want them to be out of for their own safety. So I think it's a combination of having communications planning, having emergency planning, and then also using software to the degree that you can to help the messaging be consistent. Because one thing that we probably all saw in Minnesota was the cross-pollination of messaging causing mass confusion and a lot of political consternation. And too many people got involved in too many things. I read about that in the news. And messaging is important. Citizens want to know what's happening. They want to know if they're in a danger zone. They want to know all sorts of things. Are the kids safe in school? And, if you have a National Guard unit, they're being mobilized? What does that mean to you? And having that consistency and that continuity that software can manage, whether it's using AI or not, is kind of important today. And we found it to be very successful.
Thank you for sharing that, Michelle. And I think that aligns with, some of what Sarah mentioned, is especially the parking garage example, that I think sometimes manual coordination can be the biggest recovery risk in some of these shared environments, right? You mentioned got to call somebody that calls somebody that called somebody that called somebody. And I think that's where that automation can help coordinate and reduce some of that dependency, which I know you mentioned that it sounds like y'all have a tool implemented today. But I think, the gist of what I'm pulling from that is a lot of times when we're talking about and we're using the word as strong as resilience, especially when defining our IT environment, it has to be engineered before the integration and not necessarily after the incidents, right? And the whole preparing to fail and, failure to prepare kind of anecdote that we hear, age-old adage that we hear a lot, really comes into play when we are in these incidents and we are in a state of recovery. So thank you very much, Michelle and Sarah, for sharing both of your thoughts there. One of the things that I wanted to do now, and Taylor, keep me on, is I'm good to share my screen here for some of the cross-agency operational risk and resilience framework. Awesome.
You have about 2.5 minutes left, so feel free. When that little timer up at the top of your screen ends 0, that's when we get kicked back to the main session. So.
Awesome. Yeah, so this is something that I know my team was able to put together. I think Taylor's going to be able to share a link to it as well. But I think this does a really good job of providing at least what we've seen from the NinjaOne side of how customers are most tackling some of this different resilience and recovery frameworks. So I think it's really cool to go through some of the different overview, the operating model. It's going to call out some of the things that I'm sure some of the folks on this call feel, right? If you feel like visibility is fragmented, if your accountability is not defined, so on and so forth, which I believe somebody from Montana shared a little bit on the accountability side and what they're rolling out, Sarah. So thank you for that. But what this goes through, oh, sorry, my mouse is going a little fast. It's going through what the 4 pillars are and kind of where we're seeing the objective, the core controls, and how we've seen customers mitigate some of the risk. Again, from NinjaOne as an endpoint management perspective, right? So I think it's pretty cool where we're seeing this from management and not just an endpoint protection or security perspective. I'm sure as you start to combine some of those different areas, you're really going to be able to deliver that true IT resilience that I think most agencies and departments are looking for. Beyond that, you're going to see some of these operational risk domains, how NinjaOne has used GovRAMP as a trust multiplier, right? I'm very fortunate, NinjaOne, I've been able to be here for 4.5 years. I've seen us go from, hey, agencies need NinjaOne to, okay, hey, we need FedRAMP, we need GovRAMP in place. And now already starting to see the trust that GovRAMP has been able to provide some of the agencies that we're serving across the country. We do have about 1,700 government customers today, and a large part of them are moving to GovRAMP to help build trust and IT resiliency. And then lastly, we actually went ahead and prepared this cross-agency ready checklist. So this is something that, as we are partnering with a lot of security teams, this is something that we'll actually start to walk through with them to make sure that, hey, are we resilient? Do we have all the frameworks in place? Are there any areas that maybe we're not addressing today? And I think, right, it came back to, I think, Sarah, you had mentioned, you know, hey, if we're in a state of recovery, one of the first things is, well, let's get together with our vendor. So this is, I think, a good way for any folks on the call as you're evaluating vendors, or you're looking at vendors, making sure that, right, I like to cross out the word vendor and say partner. And I think this is how you make sure that whoever you're looking to work with from an IT perspective is being a true partner to you, because it's not just, hey, look at my tool, let's get it implemented, but hey, here's where the tool can add value and here's how we're looking at forward value. Thank you.